Picture this. Waves of enemy soldiers charging through dense jungle undergrowth, their battle cries echoing through the humid air, convinced they're about to overrun a handful of Marines dug into the volcanic soil. They expect easy prey, young Americans far from home, exhausted from weeks of island fighting. Instead, they meet something that will haunt their nightmares forever. The relentless chatter of American M1919 machine guns cutting through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. What happened next defied every tactical manual the Japanese had ever written, and the terror in their survivors' voices would echo through prisoner interrogation reports for months to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Who was the Marine behind the gun that turned a certain Japanese victory into their most devastating defeat? How did one weapon position become the graveyard where an entire regiment's confidence went to die? The morning mist clung to the coral ridges of Bishio Island like ghostly fingers, reluctant to surrender to the Pacific sun. November 1943 had brought the United States Marine Corps to this speck of land in the Tarawa Atoll, a place so small you could walk its length in 20 minutes, yet so strategically vital that both sides were willing to bleed the ocean red for its possession. The Japanese had spent 2 years transforming this tropical paradise into a fortress of concrete bunkers, steel spikes, and interlocking fields of fire. They called it impregnable. The Marines called it Tuesday. Sergeant Michael Joseph Kowalski crouched behind his M1919A4 machine gun, its bipod legs dug deep into the sandy coral that passed for soil on this god-forsaken strip of land. The weapon, weighing 31 pounds of American industrial might, represented everything the enemy feared about confronting the United States war machine. Its water-cooled barrel could sustain rates of fire that would melt lesser weapons, and its .30-06 Springfield cartridges could punch through jungle vegetation, wooden fortifications, and human flesh with equal efficiency. Kowalski was not the kind of Marine who ended up on recruiting posters. At 22, he stood barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, his Polish ancestry evident in his broad shoulders and the stubborn set of his jaw. He had grown up in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where his father had worked double shifts to keep food on the table during the Depression. The rhythmic hammering of industrial machinery had been the soundtrack of his childhood, and now, halfway across the world, he found himself behind another machine designed to shape the world through repetitive, mechanical precision. The machine gun had been assigned to him not because he was the biggest or the strongest Marine in his unit, but because he possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. While other men's hands shook when bullets cracked overhead, Kowalski's fingers remained steady on the trigger. His squad leader, Staff Sergeant Raymond Martinez, had noticed this quality during training exercises at Camp Pendleton, where Kowalski had consistently placed more rounds on target than men with twice his experience. The island of Bishio measured just 2 miles long and 800 yards at its widest point, yet the Japanese had managed to cram 4,500 defenders onto its coral surface. These were not the green recruits or conscripted laborers that American forces had encountered on other islands in the Pacific. The 3rd Special Base Force, under the command of Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, represented some of the most experienced amphibious warfare specialists in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many had cut their teeth in the early campaigns of the war, from the conquest of Wake Island to the lightning advance through the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Shibasaki had boasted that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence rested more than mere bravado. The Japanese had constructed over 500 pillboxes.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Pillboxes, bunkers, and gun emplacements across the island's surface, each positioned to create overlapping zones of destruction.
Coconut palm logs, some 4 feet in diameter, had been stacked and reinforced with concrete to create walls that could withstand direct hits from naval artillery. Underground tunnels connected defensive positions, allowing troops to move unseen beneath the surface, while American bombs fell harmlessly on empty positions above. The defenders had also prepared for the psychological aspects of warfare with methodical precision. Japanese doctrine emphasized the spiritual superiority of their warriors over the materially wealthy but spiritually weak Americans. Their training stressed that individual death in service to the emperor was not only acceptable but glorious, while surrender represented the ultimate dishonor. This philosophy had proven devastatingly effective in earlier engagements, where Japanese soldiers had fought literally to the last man, unnerving American troops accustomed to enemies who knew when they were beaten. Kowalski understood none of these grand strategic considerations as he checked his ammunition belts for the 3rd time that morning. His world had narrowed to the immediate tactical concerns of a machine gunner preparing for combat: fields of fire, ammunition supply, crew coordination, and the mechanical condition of his weapon. The M1919 beside him represented the culmination of decades of American military engineering, incorporating lessons learned from the trench warfare of World War I and refined through countless hours of testing and improvement. The weapon's operating system was elegantly simple in concept, yet brutally effective in execution. Recoil from each fired cartridge operated a mechanism that ejected the spent case, loaded the next round from the ammunition belt, and fired again, all in a fraction of a second. The water jacket surrounding the barrel absorbed the tremendous heat generated by rapid fire, allowing sustained fire rates that would be impossible with air-cooled weapons. In the hands of a skilled operator, the M1919 could maintain accurate fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, far beyond the effective range of the bolt-action rifles carried by most infantry. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, Kowalski's assistant gunner, emerged from the jungle carrying another case of ammunition. At 19, Rodriguez represented the new generation of Marines flooding into the Pacific Theater, young men who had learned their trade not in the peacetime Marine Corps of the 1930s, but in the urgent training camps established after Pearl Harbor. He had grown up in the desert landscapes of New Mexico, where his grandfather had taught him to hunt jackrabbits with a .22 rifle, developing the steady hands and sharp eyes that made him invaluable as a machine gun crew member. The two Marines had been paired together during training at Camp Lejeune, where they had drilled endlessly on the intricate dance required to keep a machine gun operational during sustained combat. Rodriguez's job was to feed ammunition belts into the weapon, clear jams when they occurred, and provide security for the gun position, while Kowalski concentrated on target acquisition and fire control. They had practiced these procedures until they could perform them blindfolded, because combat often took place in conditions where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The morning air carried the salt tang of the Pacific Ocean, mixed with the green smell of tropical vegetation and the lingering odor of high explosives from the previous day's naval bombardment. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers had pounded the island with shells ranging from 5 inches to 16 inches in diameter, theoretically obliterating every defensive position the Japanese had constructed. The bombardment had been so intense that Marine commanders had privately worried there would be nothing left for the assault troops to do but walk ashore and plant flags. Reality had proven far more
complex. Japanese engineers had designed their fortifications to withstand exactly this kind of punishment, using principles learned from observing American industrial construction techniques. Concrete bunkers had been built with walls 6 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails salvaged from the island's former mining operations. Ammunition and supply bunkers had been placed underground, connected by tunnels deep enough to survive direct hits from the largest naval guns in the American arsenal. More importantly, the Japanese had learned to use the bombardment itself as a tactical advantage. Rather than attempting to prevent American forces from landing on the beaches, they had constructed their main defensive line inland, where naval gunfire would be less accurate and close air support more difficult to coordinate. This strategy would force American assault troops to advance across killing zones that had been precisely surveyed and registered by Japanese artillery observers. Kawasaki felt the ground vibrate beneath his boots as another salvo of naval gunfire crashed into the island's interior. Each explosion sent coconut palms spinning through the air like matchsticks, while clouds of pulverized coral dust rose to mix with the black smoke of burning fuel dumps. To an observer aboard the offshore fleet, the island appeared to be disintegrating under the weight of American firepower. But Kawasaki had been a Marine long enough to know that appearances could be lethally deceiving. The machine gun position had been carefully selected by Staff Sergeant Martinez after hours of reconnaissance through the jungle undergrowth. It commanded a natural avenue of approach that any attacking force would have to use, while providing multiple escape routes if the position became untenable. The gun had been dug in behind a fallen coconut palm that provided both concealment and protection from small arms fire, while coral rocks had been arranged to create additional cover for the ammunition supply and crew positions. Martinez himself was a pre-war Marine, one of the old breed who had learned their trade in the banana wars of Central America during the 1920s and 1930s. He possessed the kind of practical combat experience that could not be taught in training schools, having faced hostile fire in Nicaragua, Haiti, and China during the years when most Americans considered the Marine Corps a small constabulary force designed to protect American business interests in exotic locations. The staff sergeant had positioned his machine gun crew with the eye of a professional gambler calculating odds. He knew that Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized mass infantry attacks designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. These attacks, known as bonsai charges, had proven devastatingly effective against unprepared defenders throughout the Pacific War, turning disciplined military units into panicked mobs fleeing toward the rear. But Martinez also understood that bonsai charges represented a calculated gamble on the part of Japanese commanders. Success depended on reaching American positions before defensive fire could inflict crippling casualties, and this required either surprise or overwhelming numerical superiority. A well-positioned machine gun, properly supported and adequately supplied with ammunition, could disrupt these attacks by creating zones of fire that no infantry formation could cross. The psychological impact of machine gun fire was as important as its physical effects. The distinctive sound of a Browning machine gun, often described as resembling the tearing of heavy canvas, had become synonymous with American firepower throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers who had survived encounters with M1919s described the experience in terms that bordered on the supernatural, speaking of invisible demons that could reach out and touch individual soldiers at impossible ranges. Kawasaki adjusted the traverse and elevation mechanisms on his weapon, testing the smooth precision of the American manufacturing that had produced its finely tuned components. He knew with a certainty that in-engine fire would be one of the most important aspects of any battle he might find himself in.
Produced it. The M1919 had been designed and built by the Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, utilizing production techniques developed in the automobile factories of Detroit. Every component had been manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, ensuring that parts could be interchanged between weapons without modification or adjustment. This attention to mechanical precision reflected a fundamental difference in American and Japanese approaches to military equipment. Japanese weapons were often produced by skilled craftsmen who hand-fitted individual components, creating weapons of exceptional quality but requiring specialized knowledge to maintain and repair. American weapons emphasized standardization and mass production, accepting slightly lower individual quality in exchange for reliability, maintainability, and the ability to produce vast quantities quickly.
The ammunition feeding the M1919 reflected this same philosophy. Each .30-06 Springfield cartridge contained precisely the same amount of propellant, loaded to the same specifications, and assembled using the same quality control procedures. This consistency allowed machine gunners to predict exactly where their bullets would strike at any given range, enabling the kind of precise fire control that turned area targets into point targets. Rodriguez began linking ammunition belts together, creating the long, continuous feed that would be essential during sustained combat. Each belt contained 250 rounds, enough for approximately 1 minute of continuous fire at the weapon's maximum rate. But experienced machine gunners knew that sustained fire was rarely employed in combat, where short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds were far more effective at conserving ammunition while maintaining accuracy. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full devastation that 3 days of bombardment had inflicted on the island. Coconut palms had been stripped of their fronds, leaving skeletal trunks pointing toward the sky like accusing fingers. Concrete debris littered the landscape, mixed with the twisted remains of Japanese equipment and the occasional glimpse of khaki cloth that marked where the bombardment had found human targets. Yet, despite this apparent destruction, Kowalski noticed details that suggested the Japanese defensive system remained largely intact. Smoke still rose from concealed positions inland, indicating that cooking fires and machinery continued to operate underground. More ominously, there were no bodies visible anywhere in the landscape, suggesting that Japanese casualties had been minimal or that survivors had already recovered their dead. The tactical situation facing the Marines was more complex than simply advancing across the island and eliminating scattered resistance. Japanese defensive doctrine called for defense in depth, with multiple fallback positions prepared in advance and connected by communication trenches and tunnels. Even if American forces succeeded in overrunning the first line of defense, they would immediately face counterattacks from secondary positions that had been designed specifically for that purpose. Kowalski's machine gun represented a critical component in American tactical doctrine, designed to deal with these challenges. Rather than advancing in massed formations that would be vulnerable to Japanese defensive fire, Marine infantry would advance in small groups, using cover and concealment to approach enemy positions. Machine guns like Kowalski's would provide covering fire, suppressing Japanese positions while the rifle squads maneuvered into assault positions. This tactical approach required unprecedented coordination between different types of military units. Artillery observers would direct naval gunfire and mortars onto suspected enemy positions, while machine guns provided continuous suppressive fire to prevent Japanese defenders from manning their weapons effectively.
Engineers cleared obstacles and provided specialized equipment for reducing fortified positions. The complexity of these operations reflected the sophistication that American military doctrine had achieved by 1943. Unlike the early days of American involvement in World War II, when individual courage and aggressive leadership had often substituted for tactical finesse, the Marines preparing to assault Tarawa represented a military organization that had learned to integrate firepower, mobility, and protection into a coherent operational system. But all of this tactical sophistication would ultimately depend on the performance of individual Marines like Kowalski and Rodriguez, who would face the immediate reality of combat at ranges measured in yards rather than miles. Their machine gun position represented both the culmination of American industrial might and the most basic element of infantry warfare: two soldiers with a weapon, waiting for the enemy to come within range. The Japanese forces preparing to contest their advance represented an equally sophisticated military organization, but one based on fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of warfare. Where American doctrine emphasized firepower and technological superiority, Japanese doctrine stressed spiritual preparation and individual sacrifice. These competing philosophies would soon meet in the kind of direct confrontation that revealed which approach could better withstand the ultimate test of combat. As the sun reached its zenith and the naval bombardment shifted to more distant targets, Kowalski felt the familiar pre-combat tension that every experienced soldier recognized.
His mouth felt dry despite the humid air, and his hands seemed to move with exaggerated precision as he made final adjustments to his weapon. The M1919 sat before him like a faithful companion, its mechanical perfection representing everything he could control in a situation where so much remained beyond his influence. Rodriguez checked his watch and whispered that the assault waves should be approaching the beach within the hour. Both Marines knew that once the landing began, their position would become the focal point for every Japanese defender who could bring weapons to bear on their location. The machine gun's effectiveness would make it a priority target, and survival would depend on their ability to deliver accurate fire while remaining concealed from enemy observers. The coral ridges surrounding their position showed signs of Japanese preparation that had not been visible from a distance. Subtle changes in vegetation patterns suggested the presence of camouflaged positions, while careful examination revealed narrow slits that might conceal observation posts or sniper positions. The enemy was present, watching and waiting for the moment when American forces would advance into carefully prepared killing zones. Kowalski ran his hand along the smooth metal of the machine gun's receiver, feeling the precise machining that represented thousands of hours of American industrial labor. Somewhere in Connecticut, skilled workers had assembled this weapon with the same attention to detail that their grandfathers had devoted to building clocks and precision instruments. That attention to detail might make the difference between life and death in the hours to come. The sound of landing craft engines began to echo across the water, growing louder as the first assault waves approached the coral reef that surrounded the island. The naval bombardment shifted again, concentrating on beach defenses while carefully avoiding areas where American troops would soon be advancing. The battle for Tarawa was about to begin, and Kowalski's machine gun would play a role that would be remembered in Marine Corps legend for generations to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption both sides had made about modern warfare. In the dense jungle ahead, Japanese soldiers prepared to demonstrate the fighting spirit that had made their army feared throughout Asia. Behind the M1919 machine gun, two American Marines prepared to show what American industrial might and individual courage could accomplish when combined with proper training and absolute determination. The morning mist had completely burned away, revealing a landscape that would soon be transformed by the most intense fighting the Pacific War had yet seen. Neither side fully understood what they were about to face, but both were prepared to fight with everything they possessed. The outcome would depend not on grand strategy or superior numbers, but on the performance of individual soldiers armed with the best weapons their nations could provide. The Battle of Tarawa was about to begin, and history would be written by Marines like Sergeant Michael Joseph Kowalski, whose machine gun position would become the crucible where Japanese confidence met American firepower in a confrontation that would echo through military history for decades to come. The first wave of landing craft approached the reef surrounding Batio Island just as the morning sun reached its full intensity, transforming the Pacific waters into a sheet of molten copper. From his concealed position 300 yards inland, Sergeant Kowalski could hear the distinctive growl of diesel engines mixed with the higher-pitched whine of outboard motors as Navy coxswains navigated the treacherous coral formations that had claimed so many vessels during the initial reconnaissance missions. The naval bombardment had ceased 10 minutes earlier, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant sound of approaching Marines and the occasional crack of settling timber from buildings destroyed during the three-day artillery barrage. The sudden quiet felt unnatural after hours of continuous explosions, and Kowalski found himself straining to hear any sound that might indicate Japanese movement in the dense vegetation surrounding his machine gun position. Rodriguez crouched beside the ammunition supply, his young face tense with the anticipation that every combat Marine recognized but few could adequately describe. The waiting was always the worst part, those final moments before contact when imagination filled every shadow with potential threats and every sound became magnified beyond its actual significance. The 19-year-old had performed flawlessly during training exercises, but both Marines knew that live combat would test reflexes and decision-making abilities in ways that no simulation could replicate. The M1919 machine gun sat motionless on its bipod, its water-cooled barrel pointed toward a natural clearing that Staff Sergeant Martinez had identified as the most likely avenue of approach for any Japanese counterattack against the landing beaches. The weapon had been test fire at dawn, sending a brief burst into a dead tree trunk to verify that the firing mechanism functioned properly and that the sights remained aligned after the previous day's movement through the jungle terrain. The sound of small arms fire began to echo from the direction of the beach, individual rifle shots at first, then the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons as both sides made contact. The reports carried clearly through the humid air, allowing experienced listeners to distinguish between the sharp crack of American M1 Garand's and the different acoustic signature of Japanese Arisaka rifles. Mixed into this deadly symphony were the deeper tones of machine guns, mortars, and the occasional earth-shaking blast of Japanese artillery pieces that had survived the naval bombardment. Kowalski felt his pulse quicken as the sounds of combat grew more intense. Somewhere ahead, Marines were fighting their way across coral sand and through coconut groves, facing the same kind of desperate resistance that had characterized every Pacific landing since Guadalcanal. The machine gun crew's role would come later, when Japanese forces mounted the inevitable counterattacks designed to drive American forces back into the sea. The tactical situation developing on Tarawa followed patterns that had become grimly familiar throughout the Pacific. War. Japanese defensive doctrine called for allowing American forces to establish beachheads, then launching coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm isolated units before they could consolidate their positions and bring their superior firepower to bear. These counterattacks typically came in waves, with each successive assault building on lessons learned from the previous attempt. But the Japanese forces on Tarawa represented something different from the enemies American Marines had faced on previous islands. The 3rd Special Base Force consisted of naval infantry and construction specialists who had spent months preparing defensive positions with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Every potential landing site had been surveyed and registered by artillery observers. Every avenue of approach had been blocked or channeled into killing zones, and every defensive position had been constructed to withstand the kind of bombardment that had preceded the American assault. More significantly, these Japanese defenders had been reinforced by veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns who brought first-hand knowledge of American tactical methods. They had observed how Marine units coordinated infantry advances with supporting artillery, how combat engineers cleared obstacles under fire, and how individual Marines reacted under the stress of close-quarters combat. This knowledge would make them far more dangerous opponents than the garrison troops who had defended other islands. The sound of combat moved steadily inland as American assault waves pushed beyond the beaches and began advancing toward the island's interior. The naval bombardment had destroyed many of the defensive positions closest to the water, but Japanese engineers had anticipated this and had constructed their main line of resistance far enough inland to survive even the heaviest naval guns. The real battle for Tarawa would begin when Marine infantry encountered these prepared positions. Kowalski checked his watch and estimated that the leading American units would reach his sector within 2 hours, assuming they maintained their current rate of advance. But he also knew that Japanese resistance would stiffen as Marines moved away from the supporting fire of naval vessels and into terrain where the defenders held every advantage. The machine gun position had been selected specifically to support Marine infantry during this critical phase of the operation. The vegetation surrounding the machine gun nest showed subtle signs of recent human activity that would have been invisible to casual observation. Branches had been bent at unnatural angles to create fields of fire, while fallen logs had been repositioned to provide concealment without blocking the weapon's traverse. Most importantly, alternate firing positions had been prepared at 50-yard intervals, allowing the gun crew to shift locations if their primary position was discovered by enemy observers. Staff Sergeant Martinez had learned these techniques during years of training exercises and actual combat operations, but he had refined them through careful study of after-action reports from other Pacific campaigns. American machine gun crews suffered disproportionate casualties because their weapons made them priority targets for enemy artillery and infantry attacks. Survival depended on constant movement and the ability to deliver effective fire while remaining concealed from increasingly sophisticated enemy observation methods. The M1919's ammunition supply reflected months of logistical planning that had begun long before the first Marines left their training bases in California. Each cartridge had been manufactured in American factories operating around the clock, using raw materials shipped from mines and mills scattered across the continental United States. The propellant had been mixed according to specifications developed through years of ballistic testing, while the projectiles had been machined to tolerances that ensured consistent accuracy at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. This attention to manufacturing detail gave American machine gunners capabilities that their enemies could not match with weapons produced under the increasing material shortages that plagued Japanese industry by 1943. Japanese ammunition quality had become increasingly erratic as strategic materials became scarce, while American production continued to improve as manufacturing techniques became more sophisticated and quality control procedures more rigorous. Rodriguez began the methodical process of preparing ammunition belts for sustained combat, linking individual belts together to create continuous feeds that would eliminate the need to reload during critical moments. Each belt contained a mixture of ball ammunition for anti-personnel use and armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate light fortifications or disable enemy vehicles. Tracer rounds were interspersed at regular intervals, allowing the gunner to observe where his bullets were striking and adjust his aim accordingly. The sound of combat continued to intensify as more American units came ashore and began advancing inland. The individual crack of rifle fire gave way to sustained firefights involving multiple weapons, punctuated by the distinctive thump of mortar rounds and the earth-shaking blast of Japanese artillery. Radio reports, when they could be received through the static and interference, painted a picture of fierce resistance but steady progress toward the first phase objectives. Kowalski had participated in enough amphibious operations to recognize the rhythm of this type of combat. Initial resistance would be relatively light as American forces established beachheads and began moving inland. Japanese defenders would conduct fighting withdrawals designed to channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones, while reserve units moved into position for the counterattacks that would determine the ultimate outcome of the battle. The machine gun crew represented a critical component in American defensive doctrine, designed to deal with these counterattacks. Rather than attempting to hold long, continuous lines that could be easily penetrated, Marine commanders positioned automatic weapons at key terrain features and road junctions, creating strong points that could deliver devastating fire against attacking formations, while remaining mutually supporting with adjacent positions. The M1919's sustained fire capability made it ideally suited for this role. Unlike rifles or carbines that required individual soldiers to load and fire each round separately, the machine gun could maintain continuous fire for extended periods, limited only by the ammunition supply and the need to change barrels when overheating occurred. This capability allowed a single weapon to generate the firepower equivalent of an entire rifle squad, while requiring only a two-man crew to operate effectively. The psychological impact of machine gun fire often exceeded its physical effects, particularly against enemy formations that relied on mass attacks to overwhelm defensive positions. The distinctive sound of a Browning machine gun had become associated with American firepower throughout the Pacific theater, and experienced Japanese soldiers had learned to recognize and fear that particular acoustic signature. Many attacks that might have succeeded against rifle-armed defenders faltered when faced with well-positioned automatic weapons. The morning air grew heavier as humidity increased with the rising temperature. Sweat beaded on Kowalski's forehead and dripped steadily from his chin as he maintained his position behind the machine gun, scanning the jungle ahead for any sign of enemy movement. The water jacket surrounding the weapon's barrel would help dissipate heat during sustained fire, but the Marines themselves would have to endure the tropical conditions that made the Pacific theater so challenging for American forces accustomed to temperate climates. Japanese forces had adapted to these conditions through years of training in similar environments throughout their Pacific Empire. Their uniforms were designed for tropical use. Their equipment had been tested under high humidity conditions, and their tactical doctrine took into account the physical limitations that extreme heat imposed on military operations. This environmental advantage would become increasingly important as the battle progressed and both sides began to show the effects of sustained combat in brutal conditions. The sound of approaching aircraft interrupted the steady background noise of ground combat as Navy fighters approached the island to provide close air support for advancing Marine units. The distinctive roar of radial engines echoed across the water as F-4U Corsairs began their attack runs, diving toward suspected Japanese positions with machine guns blazing and bombs falling in carefully planned patterns designed to disrupt enemy defensive preparations. But air support would be of limited value once Japanese forces launched their counterattacks because the fluid nature of close combat made it impossible to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces from the air. The burden of defeating Japanese attacks would fall primarily on ground-based weapons like Kowalski's machine gun, which could deliver precise fire under conditions where artillery and air support became too dangerous to employ. The tactical situation facing both sides reflected fundamental differences in military doctrine that had developed throughout the Pacific War. American forces emphasized firepower and material superiority, using their industrial advantages to equip individual soldiers with weapons that maximized their effectiveness on the battlefield. Japanese doctrine stressed spiritual preparation and individual sacrifice, training soldiers to accomplish through willpower and determination what their enemies achieved through superior equipment. These competing philosophies would soon be tested in the kind of direct confrontation that revealed which approach could better withstand the ultimate pressures of combat. The outcome would depend not on abstract strategic considerations, but on the performance of individual soldiers like Kowalski and Rodriguez, whose machine gun position represented both American industrial might and the most basic elements of infantry warfare. Rodriguez whispered that he could hear movement in the jungle ahead, a subtle rustling that differed from the natural sounds of wind through vegetation. Both Marines froze, straining to identify the source of the disturbance while keeping their weapons ready for immediate action. The dense tropical growth made visual observation impossible beyond 50 yards, requiring defenders to rely on sound and intuition to detect approaching enemies. The movement grew more distinct, resolving into the unmistakable sound of human beings attempting to move quietly through dense undergrowth. Multiple individuals were advancing toward the machine gun position, following what appeared to be a deliberate plan rather than random patrol activity. Kowalski eased the safety off his weapon while Rodriguez prepared to feed ammunition into the gun's mechanism. The first Japanese soldiers became visible as shadows moving between tree trunks, their khaki uniforms blending effectively with the dappled light filtering through the forest canopy. They advanced in small groups, pausing frequently to observe and listen before moving to new positions. Their movement techniques demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that American intelligence reports had predicted, but which few Marine units had actually encountered in previous campaigns. Kowalski counted at least 20 enemy soldiers within his field of view, with more movement visible deeper in the forest, suggesting a much larger force was approaching. This was not a patrol or reconnaissance element, but a full-scale attack formation moving with purpose toward what they apparently believed was an undefended sector of the American perimeter. The machine gun crew had achieved perfect surprise, remaining undetected while enemy forces moved into optimal killing range. The Japanese advance continued with methodical precision, each group covering the movement of adjacent units while maintaining communication through subtle hand signals and predetermined movement patterns. Their officers were clearly visible, distinguishable by their sword carrying and the deference shown by enlisted personnel. These leaders appeared confident and experienced, conducting their advance with the kind of tactical competence that made Japanese forces so formidable throughout the Pacific War. But confidence became vulnerability when enemy forces moved unknowingly into carefully prepared ambush positions. The machine gun's field of fire had been precisely calculated to cover the most likely avenues of approach, with range cards prepared for specific terrain features and predetermined targets. Every tree, rock formation, and clearing within 800 yards had been surveyed and marked, allowing the gun crew to deliver accurate fire even under conditions of limited visibility. Kowalski waited until the leading Japanese elements reached a fallen coconut palm that marked the optimum firing range, then squeezed the trigger and held it down. The M1919 erupted with its characteristic rapid-fire chatter, sending a stream of .30 caliber bullets directly into the advancing formation at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Japanese soldiers diving for cover found themselves caught in a precisely planned killing zone where every potential hiding place had been registered and marked by the American gun crew. The machine gun's transverse mechanism allowed Kowalski to sweep his fire across the entire width of the enemy formation, while the weapon's sustained fire capability meant that suppression could be maintained continuously rather than in the brief bursts possible with individual rifles. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. Japanese soldiers who had advanced with confidence suddenly found themselves facing the kind of concentrated firepower that their training had not prepared them to counter. The distinctive sound of the American machine gun, magnified by acoustic effects of the dense forest, created an impression of multiple weapons firing simultaneously from concealed positions throughout the area. Enemy soldiers began calling out positions and attempting to coordinate return fire, but their voices revealed confusion and growing panic as they realized they were facing a well-prepared defensive position rather than the isolated American patrol they had expected to encounter.
Casualties mounted, and unit cohesion collapsed. What had begun as a coordinated advance by an experienced infantry company devolved into a desperate struggle for survival as individual soldiers found themselves trapped in an increasingly deadly crossfire. The machine gun's ability to shift fire rapidly between targets meant that no position remained safe for more than a few seconds. Kowalski observed enemy soldiers attempting to establish firing positions behind fallen trees and coral outcroppings, then systematically engaged each position with precisely aimed bursts that either eliminated the threats or forced them to abandon their weapons and seek cover elsewhere. The gunner's training and experience allowed him to make rapid target acquisition decisions while maintaining the kind of fire discipline that conserved ammunition and prevented barrel overheating. The battle continued with increasing intensity as more Japanese forces arrived to reinforce the initial attack. Fresh troops moved forward through the forest, apparently unaware of the fate that had befallen their comrades until they too encountered the devastating fire from the concealed machine gun position. The American weapon's capability to engage targets at extended range meant that enemy reinforcements came under fire long before they could effectively return it. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive assault tactics designed to close with enemy positions quickly enough to negate American firepower advantages. But these tactics proved counterproductive against a well-positioned machine gun that could maintain accurate fire at ranges where enemy small arms remained ineffective. The result was a series of futile charges that achieved nothing except to increase Japanese casualties while leaving the American position unthreatened. Rodriguez noted that they had already expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, approximately one-fourth of their total supply, but the tactical situation suggested that the engagement was far from over. More Japanese forces continued to arrive, and radio reports indicated that enemy attacks were developing simultaneously across multiple sectors of the American perimeter. The machine gun crew would need to maintain their position and continue fighting regardless of ammunition constraints. The weapon's water-cooled barrel remained within acceptable temperature limits despite the sustained fire, demonstrating the engineering excellence that made American automatic weapons so reliable under combat conditions. The cooling system absorbed heat generated by rapid fire and dissipated it through the large surface area of the water jacket, allowing continuous operation that would have been impossible with air-cooled weapons. Japanese officers could be heard shouting orders in their native language as they attempted to coordinate a more effective assault against the American position.
Their voices carried clearly through the forest, revealing growing desperation as previous tactics failed to achieve any meaningful results. Enemy forces had superior numbers but found themselves unable to exploit this advantage against a defensive position that negated their traditional strengths. The sound of additional automatic weapons began to echo from other sectors as more American machine gun crews engaged Japanese attacks throughout the area. The distinctive chatter of M1919s mixed with the sharper reports of Browning automatic rifles and the steady crack of M1 Garands as Marine infantry joined the battle. The entire American perimeter was under attack, but defensive preparations were proving effective against enemy assault tactics. Kowalski shifted his fire toward a group of Japanese soldiers who were attempting to maneuver around the left flank of his position, using a concealed gully that offered protection from direct observation. The gunner's knowledge of local terrain allowed him to anticipate this movement and position his fire to block the attempted flanking maneuver before it could develop into a serious threat. The machine gun's bipod mounting provided the stability necessary for accurate fire at ranges where enemy small arms remained ineffective.
Casualties mounted and unit cohesion collapsed. What had begun as a coordinated advance by an experienced infantry company devolved into a desperate struggle for survival as individual soldiers found themselves trapped in an increasingly deadly crossfire. The machine gun's ability to shift fire rapidly between targets meant that no position remained safe for more than a few seconds. Kowalski observed enemy soldiers attempting to establish firing positions behind fallen trees and coral outcroppings, then systematically engaged each position with precisely aimed bursts that either eliminated the threats or forced them to abandon their weapons and seek cover elsewhere. The gunner's training and experience allowed him to make rapid target acquisition decisions while maintaining the kind of fire discipline that conserved ammunition and prevented barrel overheating. The battle continued with increasing intensity as more Japanese forces arrived to reinforce the initial attack. Fresh troops moved forward through the forest, apparently unaware of the fate that had befallen their comrades, until they too encountered the devastating fire from the concealed machine gun position. The American weapons' capability to engage targets at extended range meant that enemy reinforcements came under fire long before they could effectively return it. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive assault tactics designed to close with enemy positions quickly enough to negate American firepower advantages. But these tactics proved counterproductive against a well-positioned machine gun that could maintain accurate fire at ranges where enemy small arms remained ineffective. The result was a series of futile charges that achieved nothing except to increase Japanese casualties while leaving the American position unthreatened. Rodriguez noted that they had already expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, approximately 1/4 of their total supply, but the tactical situation suggested that the engagement was far from over. More Japanese forces continued to arrive, and radio reports indicated that enemy attacks were developing simultaneously across multiple sectors of the American perimeter. The machine gun crew would need to maintain their position and continue fighting, regardless of ammunition constraints. The weapon's water-cooled barrel remained within acceptable temperature limits despite the sustained fire, demonstrating the engineering excellence that made American automatic weapons so reliable under combat conditions. The cooling system absorbed heat generated by rapid fire and dissipated it through the large surface area of the water jacket, allowing continuous operation that would have been impossible with air-cooled weapons. Japanese officers could be heard shouting orders in their native language as they attempted to coordinate a more effective assault against the American position. Their voices carried clearly through the forest, revealing growing desperation as previous tactics failed to achieve any meaningful results. Enemy forces had superior numbers, but found themselves unable to exploit this advantage against a defensive position that negated their traditional strengths. The sound of additional automatic weapons began to echo from other sectors as more American machine gun crews engaged Japanese attacks throughout the area. The distinctive chatter of M1919s mixed with the sharper reports of Browning automatic rifles and the steady crack of M1 Garands as Marine infantry joined the battle. The entire American perimeter was under attack, but defensive preparations were proving effective against enemy assault tactics. Kowalski shifted his fire toward a group of Japanese soldiers who were attempting to maneuver around the left flank of his position, using a concealed gully that offered protection from direct observation.
The gunner's knowledge of local terrain allowed him to anticipate this movement and position his fire to block the attempted flanking maneuver before it could develop into a serious threat. The machine gun's bipod mounting provided the stability necessary for.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.